how we can get the copy of this?
Hello, everybody, and welcome to this Facebook Town Hall. We are so happy to have so many of you joining us, not just from the Valley, but also in Southern Arizona for this truly first of its kind statewide discussion about what's happening in education right now. I'm Danielle Lerner, an anchor and education reporter here at ABC15. I'm joined by Valerie Cavasso. She is the evening anchor. She's also an investigative reporter for our sister station in Tucson, KGUN9. She has covered education extensively for more than a decade. So she is a wonderful resource, and I'm so excited to be doing this town hall with her. And then also you'll see in the screen below Valerie, we have Steve Holmes. He is the superintendent of Sunnyside Unified School District in Tucson. Welcome. Thanks so much for being here. And next to him, we have Melissa Castillo. She is the associate superintendent of high academic standards for students with the Arizona Department of Education. So we have about 45 minutes, and we're really going to dive into what we're already seeing as far as the pandemic's impact on education here across the state. We're going to talk about learning gaps that districts across the state are seeing, the rising number of F grades that some districts are already dealing with, and how they're working to support students and teachers. And we just want to be clear right off the bat. The intention of this is not to place blame anywhere. We are not blaming teachers or schools or parents for this. This is a tough, unprecedented situation. And so our goal today is to really dive into some of the data that we're seeing so that we can discuss this very real issue that's happening across our state. Valerie, I know you've been really looking into this extensively in Southern Arizona as well.
Yeah, and we've covered this. The issue that we're seeing here is in education, it is very difficult to change things up quickly. As I was described early, years ago from a state lawmaker said, trying to change anything in education is like turning the Titanic. It does not change on a dime, but yet the administrators, the schools, the districts, even the state has had to adjust because of the pandemic, and it hit us hard and it hit us fast. So this is the type of thing where I think the more that everybody understands the dynamics and the logistics of what's happening in a district, in schools, and even in a classroom, because it really comes down to all of that. What is happening in a classroom? What's happening with the students? And this is kind of like that explanation. Now that we have gone into after the second semester, now we're seeing that the districts are having to, they were alarmed at first of what had happened. There is no precedent on this. So you just have no idea. You just have to wait and see sometimes and do everything that you can to make it work. And now we're working in the second semester. So you're seeing what happened in the first semester, then how do you adjust and how do you fix? So that's what we're doing here at this time. And this is a good time because it's right before AZmerit testing, and everybody's going to be preparing for that. That is being done in person as well. That's another logistical challenge that the districts and schools are facing. So let's start with then the state. Danielle, if you want to take it.
Yeah, sure. Melissa and I had the chance to chat about this a bit over the weekend. And one of the things that stood out to me, Melissa, as we were talking is, again, we're not placing blame here, but that this is a very real issue that districts are dealing with. And they're looking at these numbers and asking themselves a lot of questions. You mentioned, they're likely looking at all of the many factors that go into these grades right now. Can you elaborate on that a little bit for us as far as what you're hearing from some of those local districts that you're in communication with?
Well, it just depends on who we're talking about and who we're talking to and where they're located. We know that there's been a huge digital divide. We know that there's also been some issues with giving kids access and opportunity to all the tools that they need in order to get schooling. So some districts tell us that it's a matter of how we provide instruction and through what platforms, and if those platforms allow us to make some really good decisions of how children are doing, where other schools may not have digital platforms at all and are still giving children worksheets to complete, and that's the approach that they're taking. So depending on the access that they have to instruction and what that instruction looks like, the struggles are very different. What we do know is consistent across the board is that educators are making huge attempts to give children access and opportunity to school and to learning on a daily basis.
Sure, and we've seen that. I mean, when this first started, I was out with the Creighton School District on their school buses, riding around as they handed out packets and meals to their communities. But one big thing, you mentioned it right off the top, is that digital divide. And, this has been an issue for a very long time, but I think we've seen the pandemic just amplify some of these issues that have already existed. And I know that the State Department of Education, that you guys have been really working to try to bridge that gap, especially in our rural communities and also on the Navajo Nation and for some of our indigenous tribes as well.
Yes, it's been a huge effort and something that's been at the top of Superintendent Hoffman's priority list, because we knew it was going to make a big difference, and again, in regards to equity and access to teaching and learning. Mm-hmm. We also know that even when students have the resources they need digitally, we have very unique populations that are sitting behind those screens. We've got English language learners who are learning not only rigorous content, but they're learning that content in English as a second language. We also have our students with special needs. And we also can't forget our students that are gifted and learn in different ways. They're also needing to be provided very specific types of supports and opportunities.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about the learning gaps and what this actually is. So discovering in the first semester, and we've done a few reports on that this is where there was this alarm in the rise, the hike in F grades. But it's more to it than just the F grades. That got everybody's attention, and that was pretty much statewide. But learning gaps is not necessarily a learning loss. There's an explanation there where you may know something, you may know math, but there might be little pieces that are missing. So a person who explained this all to me was Steve Holmes. So Steve, if you can kind of talk about this and just, kind of help us define what the learning gap is.
Sure. Let me frame it around kind of three concerns that we've been discussing. First, thank you for referring to the two gaps more than loss. I still subscribe to the notion that students don't lose learning. You don't lose learning. You create gaps in additional learning, but the learning is still there. We just got to try to make sure it surfaces and it make connections for students. But I think we've framed the issue around kind of three major areas of concern. One, of course, you've discussed earlier, which is the digital divide or the gaps in access to technology and Wi-Fi. Two, the issues associated with disengaged youth. There's stories I know we've done on that, Valerie, you and I specifically, on students that aren't showing up. What are those contributing factors? How much of it is home life? How much of it is just some issues of concern with mental health? And thirdly is the issues associated with this new modality of instruction relative to teachers being able to adapt quickly to be able to teach both online and engage students, right? And so all those contribute to what we now see as these gaps in learning, which continue to get exacerbated as we stay in this modality. Fortunately, we're starting to open up and see districts open up and begin to address it. That being said, we also know that it's not just about grades. The reason I say that is that many school districts across the state and across the country have implemented what's called standards-based report carding. So you don't have a traditional A through F system. And so much of what is measured is mastery of those content standards relative to a 1, 2, 3, or 4, which aren't really necessarily translate into an A, B, C, or D, right? And so that just is another area of both interest for those viewers, but more importantly, just so we can clarify this is why I think it's best to talk about it in terms of the gaps and just looking at grades in of itself.
Let's dive a little bit deeper, Steve. Let's talk about specifically math, because we're seeing that the core subjects are the ones that are being hit the hardest. And that's where you don't want to see that. That is what they're testing, obviously, on the AZmerit as well. So the electives, they tend to do a little better because, they're more fun. So let's go a little bit deeper and to explain what we're talking about, the gaps that say math. It's a building block.
That's
So if you don't get one set of skills, then you're not going to get it as you go and you move from multiplication to fractions to algebra 2. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so great point. So math has been a continuous struggle. As we shifted to new standards, there's been a significant difference in the way we approach mathematics. The issue with algebra has been a conversation that I've been having for a number of years, even prior to the pandemic. We had high failure rates in algebra years back and began to address it by really focusing on coherence in the system in mathematics and working not just on isolated grade levels, but really thinking about how do these standards work in clusters of chunks of transitions to grades, right? And so one of the concerns that I have is that as we begin to try to address some of these gaps, as we go back to old methodologies that actually work against students' abilities to master content and be proficient in algebra. Even though there's a clear sequence of learning that has to happen K-12, it's not specific to just one grade level. In other words, there are some transitions to key grades that actually where those grade level standards work in concert. And so those are the things that we're looking at right now, specifically to begin to address these gaps so that we're not going back and reteaching just old content, that we're looking at prioritizing content in the learning and more specifically sticking to grade level content with the rigor associated with that so that we don't create more gaps by trying to address gaps. Hope that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think it'll be interesting to see, going into next school year, I've already heard from a few districts up here in the Valley that they're starting to really adjust their curriculum to kind of meet some of the gaps that may be there from this school year, just to try to, not just help students catch up, but to also continue to do well, especially in those core subjects. Something that also I want to highlight here that's really unique is we have a local school district and we have the State Department of Education here. And so this is a great opportunity as well as they're listening to each other and speaking to each other here on this town hall. And so Melissa, if you could kind of spell out for folks out there, because I think sometimes they don't quite understand the state's role as opposed to maybe the local district's role in things. Can you just kind of lay out the work that your department is doing with those local districts, how you're supporting them, and what support they'll continue to need beyond this school year?
So I think it's a great question. Thank you for answering that, because there's oftentimes some confusion in how much we can direct our schools to do versus what our role is in guiding and supporting our schools. So we know we're in a locally controlled state. So decisions made specific to opening schools, the type of curriculums that they're going to use, going back to Steve's point in regards to how we're teaching math and the concerns about math and how it's really learned differently now. But right now, really, our main goal is to ensure that we are providing as much guidance as possible, and at the same time ensuring that our LEAs continue to be reminded of those state as well as federal requirements that we are responsible for governing and monitoring. And that makes it tricky sometimes, right? Because what we have to still expect schools to do, monitor them in doing, is difficult to do right now in the middle of a pandemic. For example, one of those being assessing our English language learners. So we're not only responsible for assessing areas like math and reading, which are critical areas in students' learning and in what we focus on in school, but we also, for our English language learners, have to measure where they're at in their language proficiency and how they're progressing in their acquisition of English, which I know Steve understands because I've seen his teachers do it, directly impacts how well they're going to do in subject areas like math. Math is no longer about just problem solving and coming up with a right or wrong answer, but there's a huge emphasis on students articulating their thinking, comparing some of the choices that they've made in coming to their conclusions or to their answers in areas such as mathematics. And in order to do that, our students have to have strong proficiency, not only in English, but in academic English. And for English language learners, it's important that we're measuring both their content understanding as well as their English language development proficiency, because they're directly related. Yeah. So those are the sorts of things that right now are still expected of our teachers to do. But because we know it's highly challenging, one of the biggest roles that we're playing, especially in my particular division, is providing them the support, the guidance, as well as some of the tools or strategies that they might use in doing just that.
I want to go ahead and incorporate a couple of our viewer comments here. Lisa Daly, this is back at about 3 minutes ago. She says, I think teachers are doing the best they can during a pandemic. Kids have lost parents to COVID also. And we just, again, want to acknowledge everybody's doing the best that they can right now. And there are so many factors that go into these learning gaps and some of the struggles that some students may be having in the classroom right now. Also, Brandy, this was about a minute ago or so. She's actually talking about how her child is doing better in remote learning. And so we also need to acknowledge that there has been success, and that, you know, some families are finding that balance and really taking advantage of that time that they have at home right now. And so we do have to acknowledge that as well. And just as Melissa, I think you mentioned, the specific issues really vary from district to district, school to school, community to community. And Valerie, I know that's something that you're seeing as well as you talk with all of the districts in Southern Arizona.
Yeah, there are, you know, those common things, but you have to address each community's needs. And that is a big issue here as well. And that is why the state looks at it a little differently as far as letting the districts do their thing, because they know their community really well. We have talked about mastery of skills and the difference, I think, between what kids need to know versus what they would like to know, what teachers would like to teach. But now I think, as I've been told by a number of districts, that they're really concentrating on the mastery of skills. And I don't know if did we have Steve Holmes, or is he still with us? But so, you know, let me ask this question then. Because of the AZmerit that's coming up, and I think there might be, you know, students might be a little nervous about that. Here we go. Steve has come back. Because I did want to talk, I want Steve to talk about the mastery of skills, you know, kind of like that need to know. That a lot of districts are kind of hyper-focused on that. So you've got your math, you've got reading, you have social studies, science, you know, that type of thing. So if you can talk about how things have changed up and the focus on these mastery of skills, Steve.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things it's super important as we're looking at kind of recovering students. We started talking about this as unfinished learning, right? So we have some unfinished business, but unfinished learning to do, and really prioritizing, working with teachers to prioritizing what are those particular clusters of learnings that have to be, we have to work on between now and the end of the year, right? The idea that we have to look at all of these discrete skills is really not the way in which good teaching happens anyway, right? It's looking at big clusters of standards, looking at big ideas. As a matter of fact, there are conversations happening here in our district really to start looking differently at our middle school grading practices, because there's been a big interest on looking at mastery learning. What are you mastering in the learning? Not necessarily what are you turning in to get a grade, right? This idea of grading, although still relevant, I'm not going to say, you know, grading we're going to throw out the window. I think there's been an opportunity through this pandemic to revisit what learning really is, and does learning really transfer into a grade, or is learning it really more about really helping students understand what that content is asking of you, and how they demonstrate mastery may not look the same for every student. There are a lot of districts out there looking at this idea of competency-based instruction, right? Where you look at what is the learning and can you show mastery and demonstrate it a certain way, and have moved away from grades. That's going to be a challenge because we still see the traditional aspects of colleges really wanting to look at GPA, and it hasn't really gained the traction at the high school levels as much as it has at the K-8. I can tell you it's something that we are looking at in our district, but it is, and Valerie, you and I spoke about this, it's not something we can just say, okay, we're changing to mastery learning and competency-based instruction this year, and teachers don't do grades this year. I want you to just look at, it really requires a lot of professional development, a lot of discussion with teachers, input from teachers, to really make sure that this is the ideological way in which we're going to look at learning versus the traditional grading system that many are starting to, quite frankly, challenge under this pandemic.
And that's done in the traditional sense. Then you throw a pandemic in there, and it has made it very, very difficult. It was a huge wrench thrown in. So let's talk about grading, though, because I know that there's been concerns. Are you going to lower the bar? Because, you know, there are all of these extenuating circumstances that families have to face, students have to face. Some students, they do thrive in this remote only environment, and then there's a lot who don't. In the traditional sense, you have said most of the superintendents have all said we got to get back to the traditional mode as fast as we can. So what are you doing with grading? And I know you talked to other superintendents as well. What has been the challenges? What has been the issues? And has it really been solved, or is that something that is going to continue to be over the course of a year or two?
So I'm a firm believer that you don't try to use policy as a way to change this in the middle of the year, right? This is something that really is about conversations with teachers who are doing the work every day, right? Because they ultimately have the final say in grades. And so if we're trying to create policy without involving teachers, then I think we're creating our own problems, right? What we've done is really work with, we have a lead teacher type model similar to what used to be department chairs. And I'll stick with high school right now because that's the area where tends to be the area most concerned, particularly with Fs, and since you have to recover credits. Working with those teachers and really getting feedback from them on some ideas that do come from Central, such as can we look at specific concepts? Can we revisit the concept of students that did mastery? So they may not have turned in an assignment, you know, at first during the first 3 weeks of school, but the second assignment really is builds upon those skills that you were trying to measure in that first assignment. Well, can you look at that second assignment as really being able to take the points for both assignments, right? Just looking creatively and working with teachers to start thinking differently around the way in which they assign not only grades, but the way in which we assign assignments, right? Are they added value, or is that just the way we've done things in the past? And are there ways in which we can look differently with teacher input so that maybe the English department starts looking differently in how their grading practices are, maybe the math department? But I'm still a firm believer of working directly with those that are doing the work every day in the classroom, because they're the ones that are dealing with the parents and the concerns they have around grading. And the seniors are a whole different ballgame. We can talk a little bit more about seniors because I know there's a great concern. I saw a comment on the chat around, you know, what are we doing specifically, or what are school districts doing specifically for seniors who are trying to graduate and may have struggled around this year specifically on getting their grades passed.
Yeah, and Steve, just to piggyback off of that, I actually had a great in-depth conversation with Mesa Public Schools yesterday, our largest district in the state, and we talked about that very thing, about that competency-based approach, particularly in the high schools. And in their district in particular, they said they're very concerned about their high schoolers, where they're seeing about a 10% increase in the percentage of students who now have at least one F in one course. And he was telling me that what the district is now doing is they're pulling they call them grade book audits, where they're pulling the grades, they're identifying the who, so which students are struggling, identifying the what are they deficient in, and then seeing if they can take that competency-based approach of can they demonstrate a skill where they understand that learning, and really working with them, especially those, he said, they have kind of a disparity in their F grades, that some are at the 10-15%. Others are right up there in that 40 to 65%, and that those are the students especially that they're doing this with to try to get them up to that next level, that passing grade. And so I love what you said about working directly with the teachers in the classroom. I mean, that line of communication is always important, but especially right now during this pandemic. And I'm sure that you would agree with that, given what your district has been doing.
Absolutely. I mean, the reality is if you start doing things central office without involving the teachers, then people become skeptical around, are you, trying to cook the grades? Are you doing things just to kind of make things look good and just passing students along? I don't think anyone benefits from just passing students around or passing students along. I think there has to be great dialogue around learning. And this is I see this as a great opportunity to revisit what grading practices really mean. And I know our teachers have been up to it. We have not received resistance. We've had really rich dialogue. And I think those relationships with teachers are what helps during difficult times to try to find consensus on what's best for children.
Let's talk about, I think this is one of the issues where there's a couple of comments here about students who are failing, A students who went to F students. And there are a number of reasons why, as we had said in the beginning, of why this is happening. But this one here kind of came up. My first grader who was cut short of kinder year in person has struggled tremendously. I feel so bad. And we talked about this as well, Steve. And you said K-12 is one of your biggest concerns this year.
Yeah, K2.
Oh, two.
Yes. Exactly. This has really been tough on parents and for the little ones, our kindergartners or first graders and second graders, particularly those that had those first graders, like I saw here, who are coming in, who missed the end of their kinder and have been in this modality for long. I mean, we have created some really large concerns around performance for those grades of students. So that's an area that we really need to quickly get at least those K2, I wouldn't say K5, but specifically K2 students in school every day. Those are the ones that struggle with attention, to stay in this modality for long. I mean, staying in a 1 hour Zoom call for us as adults is a challenge. Imagine for those little ones, right, who are doing this. It's not the greatest modality for younger children. And so we need to do a lot of catch-up work. We're already planning how we get the younger ones back in school more days a week. But more importantly, we're also looking at what does summer school look like into June and July, specifically just working on that unfinished learning that didn't happen and really building skills. That's where specifically we have to go back and look at those skill developments in literacy and mathematics that may have been missed, even though they've been covered, may have been missed because of just disengagement or just attention, and quite frankly, the age appropriateness of staying in this modality too long.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I want to bring that point up too, because obviously the state is working on that, the ADE, and Dr. Castillo, if you can speak to how the districts are going to get help. Obviously, they need financial help to be able to pay for the teachers during the summer. I was also speaking with a different district, the Vail School District, who said, this isn't a summer fix. This cannot be done because we're talking about extensive learning gaps here. But if you can explain then how the state is directly, hopefully going to help these districts kind of at least get that ball rolling during the summer leading into the next school year.
Absolutely. And I would agree with everything that Steve has said. We are also especially concerned with our young learners and early literacy. We also know that the social and emotional element of this is going to be significant, and it's something that we're paying a lot of attention to. We currently have a couple grants. Many of our schools with our most vulnerable populations across the state have qualified for. One of them in particular is focused on acceleration and ensuring that we're thinking about ways immediately, starting with summer school, that we can begin to address the needs of our young learners, looking through that lens of SEL, and then how we might build some of those language and literacy skills that we know that they're going to need in order to continue to move forward in school. We also received a comprehensive literacy grant that not only includes K-12, but is also looking at pre-K, which is important, early childhood, before our kids even move into our traditional public school system, starting at kindergarten. So those are a couple things that we're working on. We're also looking at our set-aside funds that will come with our next round of ESSER money, and how we might continue some of those intensive supports for our LEAs as they work learners, because we know based on research that if there are certain things that don't happen by a certain grade level, our kids are only going to continue to fall further behind. So we send guidance out continuously. We reach out to the field. I think Steve's point about really speaking to our teachers and asking them about what is actually happening in the classroom, what do they see as critical needs, and how can we help prepare them for what they know is going to need to be addressed when kids are back in school face to face.
And Melissa, that was something that you and I talked about this weekend when we brought up that right now in the next few months is when we're going to start seeing districts and governing boards really going through those budgets and starting to finalize those for next school year. And you mentioned that the state would really be working with the districts as well to help them make these really crucial decisions going into next school year.
Yeah, and we're looking forward to that opportunity. I think funding is important, but it can also cause a little bit of chaos, right? Making decisions, it's hard to determine clearly or exactly what it is that our kids need right now. We know that they're going to need accelerated learning opportunities, but we need to make sure that those are very intentional, that they're very targeted, that we're very strategic, that they're funded in a way that they can be sustained, right? And that as they're implemented, our educators have the support they need to be successful, to monitor implementation, to reflect on implementation, and use what they're learning to make good decisions, not only immediately in response to our students and their needs, but ongoing, because this is going to be a very long process. We've always talked about how important it is in education to look at things from a 3 to 5 year perspective or over a 3 to 5 year window. I think we're going to have to even think about things beyond that, because this is going to impact not only students for a long time, but our teachers and our leaders that are also working through this.
I think that's a good point on length of time, how many years it would take. And even though, you could say, well, it happened in a year, so it should only take a year for this to be able to correct itself. But that is not the case, because when you lose certain critical skills, depending on what happened before, because even with the math issues, this is not a new problem. So especially with reading, with math, that if you have a child who was struggling for a year, maybe they might be able to get back to where they were 2 years. And it's almost nearly impossible for some students, especially those who might have some learning disabilities and all that. And they might not ever get to a good level of Algebra 1, Algebra 2. That's just an example of what could happen. So you have to do now so much more than you had in a traditional sense. And Steve, if you can kind of speak to that, what do parents need to know? We have to be really realistic about this. And I think, parents may feel, okay, let's get going. Summer school's done and we're going to start right where we left off before. So if you can explain, Steve, kind of what parents should know, what should they expect as they go into the summer and into the next school year?
So two things. Okay, one, if your student's on track and you know that, then it's great. But I think we have to also help parents understand what on track really means, right? I mean, it doesn't necessarily always mean that you're performing at the highest level at every grade level. I think parents right now who are concerned about their students' progress, I'm going to speak specifically K-8, have to be really thinking about and working with their teachers and their principals at their local schools to talk about, how do I get my student ready for third grade? If you're a student that's K1, 2, if you're a student in 3, 4, 5, how am I getting my student ready for sixth grade and the expectations for sixth grade? And then equally important, how am I getting my student ready for ninth grade? I think that is the questions that parents need to be asking, because it's going to take that transition of 1 or 2 years to really get them prepared for what I believe to be those key transition grades that are important, specifically in the way these assessment structures are given and how the standards work together in the learnings that are expected, right? So really, again, 3rd, 6th, and 9th grade are those key places where, depending on where your student is relative to those grade levels, really helping, working with your teachers to understand what do my students need to do now to get ready for that, and over the course of the next few years leading to that transitional grade, how far is my student behind, and what can I do, or what does this student need to do to be ready for those transitions?
The biggest issue that you've talked about, and a lot of districts have, is students not showing up. And that is going to be a big factor as well, because even through the rest of this semester, them showing up, because that's where the learning gaps happen. But if not showing up has been an issue and continues to be an issue, and you're preparing them for summer school and to, in a sense, learn some of those skills that we're missing, that has got to be a tremendous challenge for you. So how are you getting through that?
I wish I had the answer. It's really is about relationships that get established with students, with adults at the school. I mean, ultimately, trying to capitalize on those relationships that students have had. Maybe it's a kinder teacher, maybe it's a monitor, maybe it's whoever that student identifies with as being an adult on that campus that cares deeply about them or has been known to have relationship with, are the people we're trying to leverage to work directly with those students who are struggling to get back. Many times it's just that phone call from that one person, but the trying to do that systematically right across the system is something that we're working on. But it's something that we also need to keep in mind as we're moving forward, that if we have students that don't identify with any adult on campus, then that's a problem, right? And so I think also this pandemic has exacerbated some children who may not be connected to school authentically in any other way, right? And so that's a school problem. But to fix that system is going to require us to really leverage all the resources of people that we have who we know, that really great person just identifies with students, and how can that person help? Maybe they're not in a formal teaching role, but they sure can help get some of these kids back by just having those conversations and leveraging the previous relationship.
Mm-hmm. And you touched on resources there. And so we do want to make sure, as we're talking about these learning gaps and some students who are struggling out there and their families who are distraught about this, what sorts of resources are out there for parents, for caregivers who are maybe trying to support their students through this? Melissa, as far as from the state's perspective, what should parents be doing? Where can they go to try to access some additional supports for their students and even for themselves right now?
Well, I think the first place they need to go is to their schools, to their LEAs. I think they need to reach out to teachers. I think they need to reach out to administrators, any sort of adults at the school, just like students would engage with. I think our parents need to engage with. Those that are closest to what's happening instructionally are going to give them the best suggestions. They're going to give them the best information that they can possibly get in regards to where they can access valuable resources. I also think that it's important that we leverage our parents within our community. We have some really tight-knit communities that we can really use to help and support each other. I also think that if we're going to lead them to the resources that are going to be most helpful, we have to be really thoughtful and reflective in regards to where children really are in their learning, so that when we do give them those resources, they understand exactly how they might use them based on what it is that their children need.
Mm-hmm.
Let's talk about the AZmerit because that is coming up. And there is a study now, the governor has ordered that the Arizona Board of Education conduct a study on the extent of the learning loss or the learning gaps. And we have heard time and time again from districts, all superintendents have told me, teachers have told me that some students do not take this seriously, especially when you get into the middle school grades. Ames, it used to be a requirement for graduation, and is no longer the case. So getting them to even pay attention to the test or take it seriously, or even getting them to take the test, those have been challenges. Now we need it, and I would imagine the state needs it for more accurate reflection on what's happening. So Steve, if you can kind of talk through about the challenge of getting everybody now in person, you're still in hybrid or remote mode. How do you get everybody back? How do you send that message out to your students? And how are you getting that message out to parents that this is high stakes, so to speak?
Yeah, the issue is, and we're going to be March 1st coming back in person. And so we've got processes to try to get students back to take the assessment. The problem is going to be, it may be high stakes for districts, but not high stakes for many parents, right? And so creating buy-in with this is going to be a big concern. And I see why the state wants to have comparative data between districts. The problem is and this is not the State Department of Ed, but from legislative priorities, this new assessment is different from the one before, the year before. So it's just, I think we're mired on this idea of big data and assessment in ways that I'm not sure are going to add great value right now. And that's going to be the big challenge, to trying to create value with something that people don't find value in at the ground level, right? And so that's our challenge. I'm not sure I have the full answer other than doing what we traditionally do to get people there to do take the test seriously. But I think it's going to be a hard sell right now.
I think there are some parents who are concerned about having their children on campus. And they've kept them out and remained remote only, even if they had the option for hybrid. So how are you addressing that issue with those parents who are still concerned?
We've had to bring parents in who are still remote for our English language learner assessment. And so it goes back to conversations, making them feel like that they're going to be in a safe place. I think a lot of our parents will come to take an assessment if done correctly and in a safe place, rather than do a daily bringing their kids to school. So again, it goes back to conversations and creating compelling reasons and a good explanation of the mitigation strategy that we have in place for safety, right? Those two factors and conversations are going to be important. It's not going to convince all parents, but it's worked well in what we've done currently with English language learner assessment. So I would think that we would probably get similar results with AZmerit.
And just real quick, one more question regarding AZmerit for Melissa. We briefly chatted about this earlier. I know even in the comments, I've heard a lot from parents recently, teachers, kind of saying, what's the point of AZmerit? We shouldn't even be doing it. But you've stressed this is just one data point that will be used as far as gauging where students are at. This is one piece of a very big puzzle.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think, especially because of the year that we've just experienced and that we're going to continue to experience, more than ever, having some sense of where students are in their learning is going to be significant. We've got to make some really big decisions in moving forward. We're going to have to be very targeted in our support. And I do think that AZmerit is going to be an opportunity to provide us some of the information that we're going to need to make some of those decisions. I also do think that assessment that is happening daily is going to be important to include in those conversations to make some really significant decisions. I also do think that we are in a place that's hopeful in regards to, we see positivity rates going down. CDC research continues to tell us that if safely done so, we can bring kids back to school. So I would agree that it's going to be important that we continue to communicate with parents, that we're very specific in our communication and how we're going to ensure that first and foremost kids are safe, and that at the end of the day, just like them, we're trying to ensure that we have everything that we need, which includes information to make the best decisions possible in supporting their teachers, their leaders, and whatever other community partners that we have to make the best decisions in providing them what they need as we continue to move towards hopefully what will one day be back to normal, or whatever normal will be when it comes to teaching and learning for our kids.
Yeah, I think everybody's looking forward to that. This is a Herculean task that everybody, the parents, the teachers, the students, the administrators, the state, thank you so much for joining us. It was very cool to have the two of you together. We're looking at the state level and the local level, and also working with our sister station. Danielle, is great. This is, I think, really valuable information, hopefully, for the people who have been tuning in.
Absolutely. And something that I know Valerie and I will continue to follow closely over these next months and probably years, if we're being honest. So again, we greatly appreciate your input and your participation today, and all of you on Facebook for watching and for commenting. Thank you. And until the next time, we'll see you then.
Thank you.